Good afternoon. This is Torah on Parashat Vayechi. It's the last parsha in Sefer Bereshis. It's one of transition. Next parsha will be then Shmos, and we'll move from the time of the Avot to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and all the events that come from that. The parsha opens announcing that Yaakov has now been living in Mitzrayim, Egypt, for 17 years, and he knows that, interestingly enough, like nobody else, Hashem gave him the ability to know approximately when he was going to die, and he also gave him the power to delay it, which he did till he finished giving blessings and everything else he wanted to do. And he called Yosef to him, and he told Yosef, I want you to swear that when I am no longer here, you will have me buried in Eretz Canaan and the cave of Machpelah. Yosef said would do it. Yaakov insisted he swear, the reason being that he did not want to be buried in Egypt because he foresaw by Nevuah prophecy that there was going to be 10 plagues, one of which was going to be kinim, lice, that were going to be running through the earth, and he didn't want that be anywhere near that. So Yosef swore. This became relevant later in the parsha because after Yaakov expired, he told Pharaoh that I swore to my father I would bury him in Eretz Canaan. And Pharaoh says, since you swore it, I will allow you to do it. Why? Because Yosef had taken an oath earlier when he showed that he had knowledge of 71 languages, including Hebrew, the wisdom of 71 languages, while Pharaoh only had 70. And his advisors had found that out, they would have overthrown him, because in those days, a leader also had to be the wisest person there. And Yosef then calls Ephraim and Manasseh, takes them to Yaakov for blessing. And even though Ephraim is the younger, he blesses him in the right hand and Manasseh in the left. One of the reasons being ultimately one of the ancestors, descendants of Ephraim will be Mashiach ben Ephraim, which I'll have more to say about in future parshas. And then Yaakov calls all of his sons together and says, I'm going to let you know what's going to happen at the end of days. But they don't tell you nothing. The parsha doesn't say anything beyond that. Then he says, and I'm gathering the sons of Yaakov, which in this case also meant the grandsons. Why? Because Hashem had taken away that power to state that Nebuah prophecy, because if people had been known how many thousands of years we're going to take before Mashiach comes, which is what the end of days is referring to, it would have been too much for the people. So that information was hidden. He then gave blessings to all of his sons. Some sounded like Musa, giving them warnings of what they need to and work on, but they were all the blessings. And after he does that, and he gives instructions of how he's to go back to be buried in the land of Eretz Canaan in the cave of Machpelah with Abraham, Sarah, and Yitzchak and Rivka, and himself and Leah, and Yosef makes arrangements. The entire nation, everybody but the children, go. All of Yaakov's relatives go for the levaya, for the funeral. And there is one little problem here, however, that no slave was ever allowed to leave Egypt, and Yosef was definitely a slave. What explained all the Egyptian government came with, and it was like a moving embassy. When one goes into an embassy of a country, even in your homeland, it's legally and territorially belongs to the country which whose ambassador it is. And the brothers then send a note to Yosef, which Yaakov never actually said that they shouldn't punish him. And the Parsha goes on and concludes with Yosef lived to see descendants of the fourth generation. And that is how the Parsha ends. Now, what I would like to focus on today is one pasuk, and it's the end of chapter 49, verse 33. And Yekal Yaakov Siva et Panav, and Yosef Raglav El Hamita, and Yegava Yosef El Amav. And it says, when Yaakov finished instructing his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed. He expired and was gathered to his people. Now, very interestingly, this is what I'm going to be speaking about, it doesn't say he died. Now, if you look at the statement of Abraham, it says in Parshas Viyechi Sarah, chapter 25, pasuk 8, V'yagava v'yamat Avraham v'sheva tova zakein Sheva Sheba and Yosef Alamav. And it says, and Avraham expired and died at a good old age, mature and content, and he was gathered to his people. Here they mentioned that Avraham died. Now, if you look at when it says about Yitzchak, and Parshas Vayishlach, chapter 35, pasuk 29, and it says, V'yagav Yitzchak, expired Yitzchak, V'yamat, and he died, and Yosef Almav, and he was gathered to his people. Zakein B'shim Yamim, and he was were fulfilled. And then it goes on to say his sons Esav and Yaakov buried him. Now the question is, we don't see that same thing with Yaakov. So there's a very interesting question. Did Yaakov in fact die? Now there's a famous Gemara on this, where there's a machloket between Rav Yochanan and Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, Yaakov did not die. Now, if that's the case, Rav Nachman said, if so, why did they eulogize him? In other words, say things after his death in Hebrew and has been, embalmed him, the Egyptians embalmed him, and they buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which sounds like normal things one does when a person is dead. Now, what I'm going to be commenting on here is partially based on the commentary of the Or HaChaim on this verse, as well as that of the Ramban and three of his early students. And the Or HaChaim asks a couple of questions on this. If that's the case, and then it says in the next pasuk, and Yosef fell upon his father's face, he wept over him, and Yiskak lo, and he kissed him. Now that sounds a little unusual. Normally, when a Jewish person dies, their whole body becomes impure, becomes tame. So why would Yosef kiss him? You don't see anywhere else mentioning when somebody died that they kissed the mace, the dead person. And it was appropriate because, as the Or HaChaim says, Yaakov was still living. He did not have any impurity because he never died. And in fact, he did not experience death, he goes on to say, in any kind of normal way. So that raises another question. If Yaakov was in fact alive, then why did they embalm him? This is the question that Rav Nachman asked. And there's a number of answers that the Or HaChaim gives that would answer the question of Rav Nachman. One, he did it out of honor of his father because all distinguished individuals in Egypt were embalmed in those times. And therefore, him being the viceroy of Egypt, second in command of Pharaoh, had to treat Yaakov with him, with that respect. Second reason is, if they had not embalmed him, the Egyptians might think he didn't die at all, because Egyptians who were so filled with impurity that they know that a body became totally impure and would decompose. And if he hadn't had him embalmed, they would have thought that he, in fact, was alive, and therefore they were going to make him into a deity and wouldn't allow him to be buried where he wanted to be buried, which is in the cave of Machpelah, because he would not have decomposed. We see that in the case of Rav Shimon bar Yochai, the son, Rav Eliezer, where his body was kept in the upper story of his house for many years and not decomposed. In even more modern times, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, Rav Eliyahu of Vilna, 200 years after he died, approximately, the Soviet authorities decided they were going to dig up the cemetery where he was, so he had to be reinterred elsewhere. And when they took his body out, his body was in perfect condition, to the point where the water of the mikveh, purity pool they had used, was still on his beard 200 years later. He was in totally perfect form. There are other stories of that. A third explanation that is given was that afterwards, when a person didn't decompose, none of the contents of the system decomposed, beforehand, before Har Sinai, until the sin of the Egel Zahav, the giving of the Torah, that was true. Before the giving of the Torah, contents could have decomposed, and saying, no, since Yaakov is alive, nothing decomposed. Now, that brings up the question, what type of life did he have, and why didn't he die? Now, the explanation that's given of why he didn't die and the others did, Abraham and Yitzchak, one explanation is given: as righteous as they were, they still were not in the same level of perfection as Yaakov, because Abraham had Ishmael, who was at the time idol worshiping, was definitely not a good individual, though he did tshuva later on. And Yitzhak produced an Esau, and therefore they weren't at the level where they merited not to die in the same way that Yaakov, because Yaakov had 12 righteous sons, as explained in Parshas Vayechi, that, in other words, after the incident, even after the incident with Reuven moving his father's bed from Bilhah's tent to Leah's tent, it announced that there were 12 sons of Yaakov, showing that they're all righteous. Hashem still recognized him as a righteous person, even after what he did there. And therefore, since all of his sons were righteous, and he had perfected himself to the level where he had 12 righteous sons, he therefore exceeded even his father Yitzchak and his grandfather Abraham. Now, what does it mean? What does that status mean? And now, the Ramban says based on a midrash, that ki nafshel tzadikim sorat netzorav achayim, that the souls of the tzaddikim, of the righteous, have a form within a form of life, zu kif al kol oliyom. And what it means is soul and the body. We have a neshama, nefesh. We also have a physical body. In the case of righteous people, including Yaakov, their soul is so constantly intermixing, overlapping every day with their body, that the body has no impurities left, is totally pure, and therefore does not require death. Because if the body is pure, the reason everybody dies is because from the original time when Adam and Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas Tov and Ra, tree of good and knowledge of good and evil, they became impure. And the only way that impurity can be removed is through death. Since Yaakov had exceeded that level, it was no longer a problem for him. So he didn't have to die. Even Abraham and Yitzchak, as great as they were, did not get to that level. Now, what does it also mean? They compare that his neshama was almost like that of an angel. An angel is pure soul. It hovers over things, and so that was with Yaakov's. His neshama was independent. It could be once he died. And it's the comparison that's given. He's like Eliyahu Hanavi. Now, Eliyahu Hanavi never died. When it was time for him to leave this world, he went up in what's best translated as a chariot of fire into Shemayim, and it's explained that he never died. And in fact, he comes back to earth to carry out missions for God, and he will be announcing when the time when Mashiach is going to be coming. And Yaakov was at that level. And therefore, there was no requirement. Another part of the explanation is basically the fire of his nefesh. They compared this to Eliyahu and Moshe, the fire of his soul. In other words, the energy of his soul maintained itself, and even though he had some physical form, it maintained itself. Therefore, we see that Yaakov is therefore at a higher level. Plus, in another way, the greatness of the people would say we're called Bnei Israel. We're not called Bnei Abraham and not called Bnei Yitzchak, because all of the purity flowed through Yaakov, and on that level he's also alive. That as soon as that, since we are still here and we are carrying on his traditions, he's alive in that sense also. And may everybody have a good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.